The morning Colonel Rayner walked out of the administration building and found Collier standing in formation with the other candidates. He stopped. Not for long, maybe 3 seconds, but in a formation of 22 soldiers, 3 seconds of a senior officer holding his gaze on a single face is not a pause, it is a statement. He walked directly to where she was standing, and without introduction, without preamble, he held up the manila folder in his hand and said, loudly enough for every candidate on that grinder to hear, "Tell me why I should waste a training slot on someone the Army spent 20 years trying to figure out how to classify." He dropped the folder at her feet. Collier did not look down. She did not reach for it. She looked at Colonel Rayner the way a person looks at something they have spent a long time preparing for and have decided they are not afraid of, not because fear is absent, but because fear has been accounted for and set aside, the way a serious craftsperson sets aside everything on the workbench that isn't the tool for the job. "Sir," she said, flat, clean, one word, no color in it. Rayner held her gaze for another beat. Then he turned and addressed the class as though she hadn't spoken at all. Staff Sergeant Nadia Collier was 32 years old. She had served 11 years in the Army, most of them in units that did not advertise their work in recruiting materials, in places that did not appear in the news cycle, doing things that required a particular combination of patience, precision, and the capacity to remain absolutely still, physically, mentally, when every instinct in the human body was screaming. She arrived at the U.S. Army Sniper School at Fort Moore, Georgia, on a Wednesday in February with a duffel bag, a rifle case she had carried since her second deployment, and the kind of composure that made people uncomfortable the way very still water makes people uncomfortable. You keep looking for the surface to move. When it doesn't, you start wondering what's underneath. The other 22 candidates were assembled in the parking area when she checked in. Rangers, special forces, infantry officers with combat patches on both sleeves. Men who had been selected from the top fraction of an already rarefied pool. They looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't fit the category they were expecting. Not hostility exactly, but the prejudgment that forms faster than thought before the mind has a chance to catch up with the eyes. A ranger named Drago, broad through the shoulders and quiet in the way that physically powerful men sometimes are, leaned toward the soldier beside him and said, "Low but not low enough. Who cleared this?" The man beside him, a Special Forces staff sergeant named Teague, considerably younger than most people there, with the look of someone still working out whether he was supposed to act like he belonged, didn't answer, but his silence agreed. Collier heard it. She always heard things. Her father had explained this to her when she was 10 years old, lying in a November deer blind in northern Ontario, while the temperature dropped and the light went gray and flat above the tree line. Hearing, he had told her, has almost nothing to do with your ears. It's attention. It's the decision to pay attention to what's actually there, instead of what you've already decided is there. Her father's name was Robert Collier, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired. Long-range reconnaissance patrol, Vietnam. 3 tours in terrain that the maps described inaccurately, and the men who walked it described only reluctantly. He had come back from Vietnam quieter than he'd left, which was saying something because he had never been a loud man to begin with, and he had spent the next 30 years teaching his daughter everything he knew about the discipline of watching the world accurately before responding to it. He had died 14 months ago, sitting in his armchair by the kitchen window of the house in Trenton, Ontario, watching the backfield go gold in the October light the way he had watched it every evening for the last 2 decades of his life. She had been holding his hand. He hadn't said much at the end. He wasn't a man who said much at any time. But in the last hour, in a voice that was mostly breath, he had said, "You already know what I taught you. The only thing left is to go where it counts." She had promised him 3 things that night, written in her own handwriting in the small leather notebook she kept in her breast pocket. The one his father had given him before Vietnam, and he had given her at 17. Serve with honor, never quit. Make the shot they say you can't. She didn't need to read the list. She knew what it said the same way. She knew her own heartbeat. Colonel Raymond Rayner was 53 years old with iron gray hair and the posture of a man who had made a career out of being correct. He had run the Army Sniper School for 9 years. He believed, with a quiet and settled conviction, that some people did not belong in certain rooms, not because they were inadequate, but because the room itself would cost them something they couldn't get back. He had never said this in those exact words. He was a careful man, but the belief shaped everything he did. Collier watched him during the first week the same way. She watched everything, patiently, without making the watching obvious, the way her father had taught her to watch the tree line for movement before you identified what was moving. She noticed the pattern within 3 days. Rayner was hardest on her precisely in the moments she performed best. When she finished first in a land navigation exercise, he extended her course by 45 minutes, with a citation about incomplete route documentation that applied to no one else. When she posted the highest first-day score on the flat range, groups that the warrant officer Slade looked at twice before writing the numbers down. Rayner arrived within the hour and administered a full equipment inspection that consumed the preparation time she would have used, confirming her 0 for the afternoon block. She filed each observation away. She kept the record the way she kept everything, methodically, in parallel with the official one, because her father had taught her that the official record and the accurate record were not always the same document. The tampering happened in week 2. She kept a personal data logbook, wind readings, atmospheric conditions, verified shot data, every variable she tracked across every exercise. One morning it was on her rack. By evening, the pages covering the preceding 8 days had been replaced with blank ones. The binding showed no signs of damage. Someone had taken it apart carefully, removed the filled pages, and reassembled it. She stood looking at her logbook for a long time. Then she sat down at the small desk in the corner of the barracks and reconstructed, from memory, every data point she had recorded across those 8 days. It took 3 hours. Her father had made her recite wind readings from the afternoon's hunt over the dinner table every evening of every hunting trip since she was 9 years old, until accurate recall was architecture rather than effort. She told no one about the logbook. Her father had told her once, sitting on a ridge in Ontario, watching the valley below, "Don't show them the wound. Predators are drawn to blood. Bleed somewhere private and keep moving." In week 3, Teague had a problem Collier recognized immediately, because she had been 23 years old with the same problem. He was technically excellent on the flat range when no one was watching. The moment an evaluator positioned behind him, his shot groups opened by 30%. His trigger pull became anxious. His breathing fought itself. She found him after formal training ended, running dry fire drills in the fading light behind the barracks. "You're fighting your exhale," she said. He looked up. She had crossed the gravel without sound, a habit so ingrained she no longer noticed herself doing it. "Your body learned breath control from competitive shooting. You hold before the shot. That works at 200 meters. At distance, the hold creates tension that translates through the trigger. A sniper fires inside the natural respiratory pause, the still half-second between the exhale finishing and the inhale beginning. You can't manufacture that moment. You can only find it and use it." Teague stared at her. "How did you know about the competitive shooting?" "Because you hold your breath the way target shooters do. It's right for what you were trained for. It's wrong for what we do here." He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his rifle. "Why are you telling me this?" It was a fair question. In a program where more than half the class would not finish, helping someone else survive was by some calculus working against your own interests. "Because that's not how I was raised," she said simply. She left him there to practice. The next day, his groups tightened by 35%. Slade noticed immediately and said nothing, but his expression said something. Word moved through the class, the way word always moves in small, high-stress groups, quickly, quietly, and with more accuracy than the people it traveled about would have preferred. The formal discrepancy came in week 4. A physical assessment, timed obstacle course under full kit followed immediately by a precision engagement exercise. Transition time mattered. The faster you moved from the course to the firing line, the more time you had to engage your targets before the clock ended. Collier realized something was wrong while still in the course. The route she had been given diverged at the 3rd waypoint. Her path added a creek crossing that no one else's route included. She knew this because she had memorized both the standard route and her marked route during the morning walkthrough. In the same habitual way, she memorized everything she thought might matter later. She completed the course. She ran harder than she'd run anything in 6 weeks, arrived at the firing line with 40 seconds less than the standard window, set up in a controlled burn of concentration, and engaged 5 of 6 targets before the clock ended. She filed a formal discrepancy notice that afternoon, citing specific waypoint coordinates and the difference in transition time. She did not do this because she expected it to change the score. She did it because she understood that documentation was its own kind of ammunition. A paper trail was a record. Records had a way of mattering later, in ways you couldn't always predict when you were making them. 2 days later, Drago found her in the common area and held up his phone without saying anything first. On the screen was a photograph he had taken during the morning walkthrough. The route markers, clearly visible, 2 distinct paths diverging at the 3rd waypoint. "I took this because I thought it was a mistake," he said. The words had weight he hadn't expected. "I figured someone put the wrong marker out and you'd notice too. Then the exercise happened." He paused. "I figured some things out." 6 other candidates were in the room. Every one of them went still. "I'm going to Slade," Drago said. "You can come or not." Teague, who had been sitting on his footlocker in the corner, stood up without announcement, picked up his coffee, and said to the room in general, "I'll go too," and walked out after Drago. What happened in Warrant Officer Slade's office that afternoon was not theatrical. Slade looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. He asked several specific questions. He took his own photograph of Drago's screen. He thanked them and told them to return to the barracks. His expression as they left was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the sum of. The transport to Fort Irwin left at 0400 on a Monday. 15 candidates remained. 7 had left the program in the preceding 4 weeks, 2 voluntary withdrawals, 2 medical drops, 3 performance cuts. 15 from 22, and every one of them sitting on that bus knew exactly what the next 3 days meant. Nobody talked much on the ride. That was normal. Soldiers in the final approach to something significant go quiet in a particular way. The way people go quiet before a verdict gets read. Collier sat near the window. She did what she always did in the hours before something mattered. She listened inward, running through everything her father had taught her. Not as a checklist, more like a conversation. The way you speak to someone who is no longer in the room, but whose voice you know well enough to hear clearly. Teague was across the aisle. At some point in the second hour, he said quietly without looking at her, "You nervous?" "Yes," she said. He seemed surprised by the honesty of it. "Me too." "Good," she said. "Nervous means you understand what's at stake. People who aren't nervous before something like this either don't care or don't understand. Neither of those is who you want beside you." He was quiet for a moment. "My hands are shaking," he said, very quietly, like a confession. "They'll stop when you start shooting," she said. "They always do. The body knows what to do. It's the waiting that makes it shake." Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. That was enough. The National Training Center range spread across high desert terrain that the California mountains had built over millions of years without any consideration for what humans would eventually attempt to do with it. The air at this elevation was thin and cold in the particular way of high desert. Not the wet cold of the coast, but the honest, flat cold of a place that had no interest in being comfortable. On the second afternoon, Rayner gathered the class at the rim of the qualification valley and stood with his back to the distance below. He had a way of positioning himself against geography that felt almost theatrical. The canyon behind him, the sky above, 15 candidates in front, wind cutting across everything. And he did it without appearing to think about it, which meant he had been doing it long enough that it was instinct. The corridor. A 600-meter engagement through a narrow valley between 2 parallel ridge lines. In 27 years and more than 600 attempts, no qualifying candidate had ever produced a confirmed hit, not because those candidates were inadequate. Many were serving in the field right now, doing things most people in this country would never hear about, because the ridge geometry created a thermal interaction that the range's original engineers had described in the installation records as unpredictable cross-influence, a wind environment that standard correction methodology could not reliably account for. Rayner stated this the way serious people state facts when they want them to land at their full weight. Then he paused. He looked across the 15 faces in front of him, and then he looked directly at Collier. "Physics," he said, "does not negotiate." He moved on to the afternoon schedule. Teague, walking beside Collier back toward the range, said in a very low voice, "That was directed at you." "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It lights something," she said. "Whether that's useful depends on what I do with it." That evening, after training ended, Collier went to the ridge. Not to the firing line, not to where the target was. She went to the southern rim of the valley, at a point above and between the shooting position and the target, where she could look down into the full depth of the corridor. She sat on a flat boulder and watched. The wind in the valley did not behave like open terrain wind. She had understood this, theoretically, from the briefing materials. She understood it differently from the rim, watching it actually happen. The two ridge lines were not creating random turbulence. They were creating something with structure, a thermal interaction that moved. She watched dust lifted from the valley floor. She watched dry grass along the corridor's center. She watched a red-tailed hawk that had been quartering the valley for thermals, its wing adjustments precise instruments, reading the air at target depth in the way animals read the environment when their lives depend on the accuracy of the reading. Her father had told her, "Animals are interpreting the world before you arrived, and they'll keep interpreting it after you leave. They don't have the option of getting it wrong. So if you want to know what something is actually doing, watch something that depends on knowing." At 51 minutes, she saw it for the first time, a rotation in the dust pattern along the valley floor. Not random, not linear, rotational. The thermals from both ridges were interacting not as competing forces, but as a single cycling system, a slow vortex that completed itself and repeated. She watched it complete once and counted. Watched it complete again. 90 seconds. She counted it 4 more times. 88, 91, 90, 89, 90. A variation of 2 seconds either way, which tracked with the temperature drop that had been occurring since sunset. Itself predictable based on the elevation and time of year. This was not chaos, this was a pattern. Hidden, yes, subtle, but a pattern, and patterns had solutions. Her heart rate went up by perhaps 10 beats per minute, and then deliberately she brought it back down. Not yet. She had identified a variable. Identifying a variable was not the same as accounting for it. She needed to understand what the cycle meant for a bullet crossing the valley at this distance and velocity. She needed to know at what point in the 90-second rotation the air produced a condition she could use, rather than compensate for. She sat on the rim and worked out the mathematics in her head for another hour. When she walked back to the barracks, it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees from the afternoon high. Slade was outside the operations building. He watched her come in from the direction of the ridge without asking where she'd been. His expression in the dark was unreadable. He went inside. The third day was the formal qualification block. Every evolution, every assessment, everything the 5 weeks had been building toward. Collier finished first overall, not by a small margin, by a margin that made the evaluators check the numbers twice. Slade checked them once, then called the other instructor over and had them checked independently. Word moved through the class the way fire moves through dry brush, fast, total, and changing everything it touched. Teague found Drago in the barracks. Drago stood in the middle of the room and said to anyone within earshot, which was everyone, she finished first overall, by 11 points. 11. Someone, no one admitted to it, started a slow clap. It lasted 4 seconds before discipline reasserted itself. But 4 seconds was enough. 4 seconds was a declaration. Collier was cleaning her rifle. She heard all of it. She said nothing, but her hands just for a moment went completely still. Not because she had stopped cleaning, because she was allowing herself for that one moment to feel the full weight of what she had done. She thought about her father. She thought about a leather notebook in her breast pocket and a list with 2 check marks and 1 line still open. One more promise left. The 4th day arrived with the particular silence of mornings that know they are going to matter. 15 candidates assembled at the primary firing line at 0800. The valley stretched below them. 50s and 600 meters away, invisible to the naked eye, the corridor's steel target waited exactly where it had been waiting for 27 years. 1 shot, 1 candidate, no coaching. The instructors were there to observe and to confirm if the impossible somehow became possible. The first candidate, A ranger whose technical proficiency had been consistent and clean across the entire program. Set up carefully, read the flags, applied his corrections, fired, miss. The valley took it, 6 feet wide of center. Second candidate, miss, third. Miss, by the sixth miss, the energy on the firing line had settled into something heavy and collective. These were not bad shots. These were excellent shots by excellent shooters, applied to conditions that were winning anyway, and everyone present understood that. Drago was the 10th shooter. He spent a long time on his environmental red. He was methodical, careful, the way he approached everything. He adjusted. He fired. The round struck the far ridge wall, 12 feet low and 3 wide. He stood up from his position, looked at the impact point through his spotter scope, and said one word quietly that no one repeated afterward, but everyone heard. Then he turned to Collier, who was standing 2 positions to his right. "The flags are lying," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, something that had been making up its mind for 5 weeks and had finally arrived. "You figured it out." "I think so." "The ridge, last night." "Yes." He stared at her another beat. Then roughly and directly, the way Drago said everything he actually meant, "Go hit it." Candidates 11 through 14 shot in sequence. Teague's round passed within 2 feet of the target before the valley claimed it. Close enough that he turned and looked at Collier with an expression of pure frustration, and she gave him a single nod that said what needed saying, without words. Then there was one candidate left. Rayner stepped forward. His voice carried across the full range, across all 15 candidates, and all the instructors, and the wind that was moving through everything. "In 27 years," he said, "no one has made this shot. Not one confirmed hit across more than 600 attempts by candidates of this caliber." He paused. He looked directly at Collier. "Physics does not negotiate," he said, the same words as before. Harder this time. A last wall built specifically for her to run into. Collier stepped to the line. She did not look at Rayner. She did not look at the other candidates, or the instructors, or the wind flags that had already failed 14 shooters this morning. She stepped to the firing line, settled into position behind the rifle. And the entire loud, complicated world she had been navigating for 5 weeks went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The difference mattered. Silence was the absence of sound. Quiet was a decision, a room her father had built inside her when she was young enough that the lesson had become structure rather than something she had to remember. Slade moved to the spotting scope. He had spotted for hundreds of candidates on ranges over 14 years. His face behind the eyepiece gave nothing away, but his right hand, resting on his knee, had closed into a loose fist, an unconscious thing. The body holding tension it hasn't acknowledged yet. Collier did not go immediately to the scope. This was the first thing Slade noticed. Every other candidate reached for the scope first, reaching for information the way you reach for the thing you trust most when you need it. Collier was looking at the valley, with her eyes, watching. Drago saw it too. He did not say anything, he watched. She was not managing nerves. She was not buying time. She was watching the valley the way you watch something you have already studied and understood, patient, alert, waiting for a specific moment she already knew was coming because she had done the work to know when it would arrive. 60 seconds passed. Some of the candidates exchanged glances. Teague did not exchange glances with anyone. He watched. Drago had his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the back of Collier's head with an expression that was unlike anything he had shown across 5 weeks of training. Not admiration exactly, something closer to witness. The conscious decision to be present and attentive for something that mattered. 78 seconds. She exhaled naturally, the way breathing happens when the body has been brought back to itself. Found the natural pause at the base of the exhale. The still half-second her father had called the quiet moment, the only moment when the body is genuinely at rest. She did not fire. She let the window pass and took the next breath. 87 seconds. The dry grass along the valley floor shifted. The dust pattern along the corridor rotated to the position she had been waiting for. The specific alignment she had spent an hour the previous evening calculating and recalculating. The point in the 90-second cycle when the thermal's deflective influence dropped to within workable margins. Her father had told her, "You don't beat conditions you can't control. You wait for the moment the conditions give you what you need, and you're ready when they do." She was ready. She did not think. Thinking was for preparation. This was for trust. She fired. The rifle moved. The sound crossed the range and broke apart against both ridge walls simultaneously, coming back doubled. A clean percussion that rolled out into the desert air and faded into the distance. Nobody breathed. Slade was at the scope. He had the target centered. He was counting the flight time. At this distance and velocity, approximately 2.1 seconds. At 2.2 seconds, clang. The sound came back from the valley 2 full seconds after the shot. Metal on metal, unmistakable. The sound of a steel target receiving a round that had traveled exactly where it was sent. Every person on that firing line recognized it immediately, and none of them would ever forget it. Slade pulled his eye from the scope. He looked at the valley. He looked at Collier, who was still behind the rifle. "Confirmed hit," he said. His voice was completely flat and completely controlled, because if he let any of what he was actually feeling into it, it would not be appropriate for a warrant officer on an active training range. Dead center. For a moment, nobody moved. The canyon was still sending back echoes of a sound that didn't have a precedent on this range. Then Teague made a sound that wasn't language, raw and involuntary. From somewhere below articulation, his hands going to the top of his head. He was looking at the valley and then at Collier and then at the valley again, as though he needed to confirm that both things were real. Drago turned away from the range. He put his hand over his mouth and stood there with his back to everything, and nobody looked at him during that moment, which was the right call. Collier stood up slowly from the firing line. She slung her rifle. She turned around. She looked at Slade. She looked at the 15 men watching her. And then she looked at Colonel Raymond Rayner. Rayner had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when he said physics does not negotiate, and he had not moved in the 90 seconds since the sound had come back from the valley. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and he was looking at Collier with an expression that was doing something private and complicated that no one watching could have named precisely. It was not anger. Anger had been there. But this was what anger becomes when it runs out of justification. Something raw underneath it, something that had been underneath the whole time and had been using the anger as a wall. He came to her that evening, near the operations building, after the rest of the class had moved inside. He stood the way men stand when they have carried something a long distance and are not certain they can set it down without help. "My brother's name was Daniel," he said. She had not expected that. He was 29 years old. He was trying to complete an assessment course for a unit he was not built for. Not physically, but temperamentally. He held on longer than he should have. He was trying to prove something to me. Rayner paused. He made it 11 weeks. The breakdown was serious. He never came back from it the same way. Collier was very still. "I have spent 15 years," Rayner said, "believing that my job was to stand at certain doors and make sure no one went through them who would be broken by what was on the other side. I told myself that was protection." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong. I was wrong about what protection means. And I was wrong about the right to make that decision for someone else." The desert wind moved between them. "I'm sorry about Daniel," Collier said. "I mean that." He nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment, then at the valley. "Your father taught you to read wind," he said. "He taught me how to look," she said. "What I did with it was mine." Rayner held her gaze, and for the first time in 5 weeks, he looked at Sergeant First Class Nadia Collier without the wall between them. Just a man and a woman standing in the desert where history had just changed by one bullet, one thermal cycle, and 90 minutes of patient watching on a cold California rim. "Sergeant Collier," he said, "that is the finest single shot I have witnessed in 22 years of this program." She held his gaze. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, clean and complete. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations building. His walk was the same as it had always been, the walk of a man who carries authority without performing it. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Perhaps 3 degrees, not much. But at 1,600 meters, 3 degrees of windage is the difference between a miss and dead center. 3 degrees in the posture of a man who had been holding himself against something for 15 years was the difference between closed and open. Slade was waiting by the operations building door. He had watched the entire exchange from 40 feet away and had not pretended otherwise. When Rayner reached him, Slade looked at his commanding officer's face and read it the way he read targets. With attention, with experience, with the willingness to accept what he saw rather than what he had expected to see. What he saw made him exhale slowly through his nose. Not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of watching something that has been under pressure for a very long time finally find a place to release. Well, Slade said. Don't, Rayner said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say I told you so. Slade considered this. I was going to say it considerably more diplomatically than that, he said. And Rayner, for the first time in 5 weeks, possibly longer, made a sound that was almost a laugh. It lasted half a second and then it was gone. But it had been there. That night, sitting on the edge of her rack in the empty barracks, Collier took the leather notebook from her breast pocket. She opened it to the page she had opened 1,000 times, her handwriting. Serve with honor, never quit, make the shot they say you can't. She read each line slowly. She had read them in tents in Afghanistan, in vehicles on roads with no safe margins, on long dark flights home. She had read them when she was too exhausted to think clearly, and when she was afraid in ways she never showed anyone, and when the world seemed arranged specifically to make her fail. She took a pen from her jacket pocket. She held it over the third line for a moment. Then she drew a single check mark beside it. She sat with that for a long time, the completed list, the leather notebook that had crossed 2 wars, the name written inside the front cover in handwriting she knew better than her own. She sat with the fullness of it, the weight and the relief and the grief and the gratitude, all occupying the same space at the same time, the way large feelings do when you stop managing them and let them take up the room they need. Then she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, in the way that private grief looks when it has been held in discipline for a long time and finally has a room to itself. She cried for her father. She cried for Daniel Rayner, who had been 29 years old and had asked the wrong person whether he belonged and received the wrong answer. She cried for every soldier who had ever stood at a door and been told by the weight of the room that the door wasn't theirs. She cried for the girl her father had taken into that November deer blind at 10 years old, who had no idea yet what the world would ask of her, but who had beside her a man with a spotting scope and 30 years of patient knowledge, pointing at distances that seemed too far and saying, "Look at what's actually there." When she was done, she closed the notebook. She put it back in her breast pocket, close to where it had always lived. She sat up straight. She breathed. And she made one more decision, not a promise. She was finished with promises. She had kept every one of them. A decision that what had happened in that valley was not the end of something, that it was the beginning of what came next. For every soldier who would stand at a firing line and be told by the accumulated weight of the room that the distance was too great, the conditions too complex, the target too small, the window too narrow. For every one of them who had almost believed it. The valley held its silence in the dark outside. The steel target hung at 1,600 meters between 2 ridge lines that the mountains had built over millions of years, without any concern for what human beings would eventually attempt to do with them. It held its silence, and within that silence it held something new now. The kind of history that rings out across an open desert. The kind that travels forward through every class that comes after. The kind a father taught his daughter to listen for. On a cold November morning in Ontario, long before the world had any idea what she was becoming.